Good afternoon and a warm welcome to European Policy Center online policy dialogue on climate security need for a joint NATO-EU strategy. My name is Ionela Ciolan and I'm a research fellow within the Europe in the World program at EPC. Today I have the pleasure to moderate this discussion. For the past decades, we experienced a rapid decay of the environment around the world. From rising temperatures to melting glaciers to extreme weather conditions, floods or drought, increasing sea levels or extinction of various animals, the climate change is unstoppable and irreversible. Climate change has also lasting socio-political consequences, economic repercussions, and acts as a risk multiplier. While this phenomenon doesn't directly lead to conflict, its ramification foster the probability for instability, insecurity, and uncertainty. The recent COP26 concluded with mixed results and with the acknowledgement that we need to better prepare for the future. Both the European Union and NATO are at the forefront of dealing with and adapting to climate threats, while the EU has set already a clear ambition in the fight against climate change. Not all the member states share the same enthusiasm, with differences among perceptions about climate-related security risks. Moreover, at NATO, within the NATO 2030 Reflection Group report, we have this idea that highlights that key areas where the alliance can improve its readiness, resilience, and preparedness by integrating more climate security measures within NATO's exercises, planning, awareness, and early warning thinking process. To try to find an answer to the question, what is climate security and how does it influence us, and to address how climate change related security threats are perceived by both European Union and NATO, what actions, policies, strategies does the Euro-Atlantic Organization have in place to limit the negative impact of climate change, and ways of cooperation on climate security within the transatlantic relations, we have today with us a stellar panel of speakers line up, including Benedetta Berti, which is the head of policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO, Erin Sikorsky, she is the director of the Center for Climate and Security and the director for the International Military Council on Climate and Security in Washington, D.C., and Thomas Waitz, member of Committee on Foreign Affairs at the European Parliament. I'm very grateful to our speaker for making the time to contribute to our discussions here today. Thank you. Now, some logistical information. After we'll have the opening comments from our distinguished speakers, we'll start the Q&A sessions. So please write your questions in the Q&A box, or if you want to address it yourself, click on the raise hand button. Please be concise as much as possible when writing your questions. So let's start with Ms. Erin Sikorsky. Let me start by asking you to give us a brief context on climate security. How can we define climate security? What effects climate change can have on security? Why should states focus on this issue?
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for hosting this discussion today. I'm joining you here from a hotel room in Philadelphia, but I hope that sometime in the next year we can all get together in person to talk about these issues. So, you know, you asked me to think about definitions of climate security, and I think oftentimes the best way to show the definition of climate security is to start with an example. And so this morning I was watching CNN actually, and they had a story about flooding in Unity State in South Sudan. The region is facing some of the worst floods in 60 years. It has completely decimated towns of thousands of people and forced migration out of the area. And CNN interviewed the country's deputy minister of climate change, and a quote he had struck me that I thought was just so perfect for today's conversation. And his quote was, "We are feeling climate change. We are feeling it. We are feeling droughts. We are feeling floods. And this is becoming a crisis. It is leading to food insecurity. It's leading to more conflict within the area because people are competing for the little resources that are available. And South Sudan, I think, is unfortunately a perfect example of the vicious cycle of climate security risks, where you have states that have been in conflict are highly vulnerable to climate shocks. And South Sudan, since its birth, has been in the grips of a civil war. But then in turn, those climate shocks can fuel further conflict, as the minister mentioned. So I just thought I would start with that as a key example, and let's keep that in mind during the discussion today of the very real effects that are unfolding right now on the ground. This isn't about future risks, it's about risks that are occurring today. And it's such an important time to have this discussion. I think 2021 has really been a watershed year in progress on climate security. And I know my two colleagues on the panel today will discuss that progress that's happened in the EU and at NATO. Here in the United States, we've had incredible leadership from the Biden administration, beginning with an executive order last January on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which set the stage for a whole slew of climate security actions. You just had the OSCE a few weeks ago adopt provisions on climate security, and tomorrow the UN Security Council is slated to have a debate on our discussion on climate change and the nexus with terrorism, and probably a vote on a UN Security Council resolution on climate security. So we've come a long way just in the past year, though the concept of climate security has been around for quite some time. Many years ago, climate change was identified by the Center for Naval Analysis here in DC as a threat multiplier. And the definition has grown, though I would say since then, to the point where there's a growing recognition of the systemic and compounding nature of climate change risks across all aspects of international security. In my previous job, before I came to the Center for Climate and Security, I worked for the US National Intelligence Council and co-authored the Global Trends quadrennial report looking out into the future about the national security landscape. And we identified climate and environment issues there as a structural driver that will set the parameters for national security for years to come. So there, it's, as you mentioned, climate change alone often isn't the driver of security risk, but it's how climate change shapes and intersects with other risks. And you see this indirectly in all parts of the globe. You can point to many examples this past summer where a climate change shock intersected, say, with poor governance of natural resources, corruption, societal mistrust in government. You can look at Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, where people all went into the streets protesting lack of access to water and energy this summer. And a lot of that was about poor governance and mismanagement, but it was also about the worst drought in 50 years in those countries, climate shock that is exacerbating that threat. You also, the other area of climate security risk that I think is important to talk about, particularly in the context of NATO and the EU, is how it shapes geopolitics and competition between states as well. So not just instability within states, but competition between states. And again, is another layer on top of already strained relationships in many cases. When you look at transboundary river basins, South Asia, the China-India relationship is a key example of this. You can look at the Mekong Delta, places where climate change will change the parameters and upend already strained relationships, and also lead to what I like to call a disequilibrium or mismatch between the systems we have developed for managing the world, whether it's managing migration, whether it's managing the Arctic, whether it's managing the Nile River Basin, for example. Those systems were all created in a world that wasn't shaped by climate change the way it is today. And so as climate change reshapes migration, reshapes the landscape of the Arctic, reshapes the Nile River Basin, we need new systems and new ways of tackling and understanding these risks so that countries can get ahead and leverage, frankly, the silver lining of climate change is the predictive capabilities we have to understand what's coming down the pike. How do we integrate that to build more resilient security systems? And I think that's a lot of what both NATO and the EU are looking to do. So I'll stop there in my opening remarks, but happy to dig deeper on any of these topics as we go, and really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sikorsky. Indeed, you brought us a lot of topics to discuss today, so hopefully we'll have some time to move with some of them at least. So now let's move to Mr. Waitz. Thank you for accepting our invitation. You are also the co-chair of the European Greens and also the rapporteur for a report within the European Parliament on the External Service Action Climate Change Defense Roadmap. May you please tell us more about this report and how climate security is perceived inside the European Union?
First of all, good afternoon from Brussels, and thank you for this invitation, for this conversation. I think it's very timely to exchange also on an international level on this. Yes, the report is basically tackling different aspects which are dealt with already in different institutions within the European Union, but also internationally. We're having very concrete cooperations with the US, but also with the United Nations on that question, on how to actually set up a new security policy linked to the effects and outcomes and threats or risk multipliers through global warming and climate change. Maybe to start with that, to show how many different institutions within the European Union are already working on that question. So in the consultations to draft that report, I was talking sure to External Action Service, to the DG Defense, so this is the Department for Defense, to the Commission Service on Foreign Policy Instruments, as an example, on the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, but also to the Defense Fund. So you see there's many parts of the European Union actually involved and working on different sides of the project on actually developing a new security policy based on also including the aspects of climate change, but also linked to that on the scarcity of resources, on the impacts, on the also diplomatic impacts it has on countries or within countries. Now, on the content, it's a multifaceted approach. I would say one of the drivers is a maybe surprising one, but it's linked to the Green Deal of the Commission and of the European Union, which is asking all sectors of European Union's policymaking to contribute to the climate goal of a reduction of 55% until 2030 and climate neutrality until 2050. And also our military sector has gotten this request to present plans how they intend to contribute to that goal. And the internal goal that our missions have gotten, and I must say the civilian and the military missions that they have gotten was minus 30% until 2030. The interesting question is, how are we measuring this? Because there is hardly any concrete data and numbers on how the missions look like today. As you may know, in the Paris Agreement, the emissions of the military sector and the armies and the troops are not included, not in the counting and not in the accounting. So that means that's the first task, to actually find out how big are the emissions today, which already leads us to an interesting assessment, because it's not the airplanes, which would be maybe the first guess, or the fuel for the tanks or other vehicles, but it is the main source of emissions within European missions is cooling and heating of the housing, of the barracks, of this infrastructure. And then next comes already the procurement and the services that are actually bought or provided to our missions. And only third comes aviation. So we see that before we actually need to talk about fuel on airplanes and so on, there's a lot of room for improvement at that sector. And so this is part of the report, is actually tackling these questions. Very interestingly, also when it came to the question of replacing fuels or replacing energy production, we already meet other interesting aspects from the question of troop security, because finally our generals realize, well, if we are on a mission in Mali and we're somewhere in the desert, one of our weak points strategically is actually the supply with fuel, because we have to go through long distances with tanks and so on, with the tanking devices. And I even had the example of a mission general in Mali who said, look, the situation was so dire on the ground, so we had to bring the fuel with the helicopter, but the helicopter consumed approximately half of what he delivered. Yeah? So they realized, if we're actually able to produce our electricity right at the camp with solar energy, which there is loads of in the Sahel zone, and then this would make us more autonomous from fuel supply. And if some of our vehicles would even be able to be fueled with electricity that we produce right there on the field, this would actually raise the security of our mission and raise the security of our troops. So they already see that there's some added value also of this development. Then maybe a second big part of the report is all the question of risk assessment, linked to the insight, which is now shared by, I would say, the majority of the actors, that global warming and climate crisis is a main driver of conflicts. It's not a sole cause. It's like conflicts are, I would say, always multi-causational, but it's a main driver, especially when it comes to potential escalation of already existing conflictuous situations. And the approach is to actually use data and the ability to forecast also problems on the ground, especially when it comes to food supply, as mentioned in the introductory statements from Sudan, that we try to actually establish a data collection and access to data and the ability to also analyze it in a way that we can actually prevent escalation of conflict. So conflict prevention linked to these insights, but not only that, then in case of, let's say, pacified conflicts, peacekeeping, in the peacekeeping sector, it's very much about also cooperation with the local population, which is a question, a decisive question when it comes to successful missions, but it's also a decisive question for the security of our troops on the ground, whether the cooperation with local population works well. And there it comes from like very technical things, like how do we set up water purification systems that we can share water with local population? How do we, but also how do we organize our cooperation and mediation within the local population? And there a very interesting proposal popped up to actually include in the future climate and defense or climate and security expertise. So stuff on the ground that brings this expertise, also linked to anthropology. So if even possible from the country, to understand the social structures, but also to understand the threats posed by global warming on the local populations. So we can actually take this into account in all our mediation processes, which enlarges the chances to have successful peacekeeping or peace building missions. So that is a very important aspect. And but maybe last but not least, also a part of the report also talks about equipment. There it comes to the question of, well, equipment of civil and military missions as such. So I mean, with extreme weather, we just also need to equip our missions in a different way. We have to make sure that the equipment that we have still functions. Just one example of French Rafale jets in Afghanistan, which were there but not able to take off because it was 50 degrees in the shade and the computer didn't turn on, so the air condition didn't turn on, and so the jets couldn't take off. But also equipping our troops with equipment that is actually able to help interacting in situations of catastrophes, so floodings and so on, droughts, I mentioned water supply, so that we also, not just for the sake of our troops, that they are able to actually deal with extreme weather, but they're also able to provide security to the local population with the equipment, because, and last but not least, to to finish with that, one of the main aims of our missions is also to safeguard and secure civilians on the ground, which is something that we need to look at from a different perspective in the light of global warming and climate change. And I stop here. There was many more details, but I hope for some interesting questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I already have some questions, but I will address you later. Now moving forward to Ms. Benedetta Berti. We know that according to this summer Brussels summit communique that climate change is a threat multiplier that impacts the alliance security. But how is climate security perceived at NATO, and which are the main climate threats for the alliance?
Sure, thank you very much. And I think there's indeed a lot to talk about. And I'm glad you mentioned the 2021 communique, which is the latest statement from NATO leaders from last June, because that's when we put on the table for the first time the fact that the alliance over the last year has agreed a climate and security agenda, which is essentially a strategy where we talk about what climate security means, what is NATO's role, and how we adapt to increase our awareness, adapt to the security impact of climate change, and contribute to mitigation. And on top of that policy, we also have an action plan with concrete deliverables. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to engage directly with your question, which is a little bit more about the definition. How do we think about the security impact of climate change? And I think that at the outset, I would say this conversation has been very important also because, first of all, because it couldn't be more timely. Time is not on our side when it comes to dealing with the impact of climate change, but also because it contributes in a way to our broader reflection about how do we broaden our understanding of security, right? Because climate change challenges a lot of the more traditional conventional approaches to security, to state-centered security, right? Because first of all, climate change doesn't know national boundaries. It is global, it is transnational, and it can only be dealt with a global, transnational, cooperative, if you wish, response. It puts us a little bit beyond looking at the state as the only source of insecurity, right? Because of course here we're not talking about just it is man-made, but it is not. It cannot be attributed to a physical adversary. So it also challenges our understanding of security. Even more importantly, it forces us to look at who's the object, who are we providing security for? And again, we look beyond the state. We look at the communities affected, at the citizens, at the societies, and we have to look beyond the militarily driven approach, because of course, although we want to climatize our security, so look at how climate change affects every aspect of our security policy, we don't want to securitize our response to climate change more broadly, right? So it is a really important subject, I would say, and also one where I know the subject of today's discussion is also NATO-EU. It's also, I would say, it's also where there's a lot of synergies, because we can only work effectively if we have a whole of government approach, cross-sectoral, and bring together the diplomacy, the development, but also the security and defense, which is really where NATO comes in. So in that sense, I would say that you already mentioned it, our framework is we recognize, NATO recognizes climate change as a defining challenge of our time, with a direct impact on our security and defense, and there are interesting synergies with, of course, with the work that has been done also on the European Union side with the External Action Service. But our scope is a little bit broader, because of course we're not just looking at CSDP, we're not just looking at out of area. We're looking very much at how do we have to change our approach to defense here at home. So we start at home. And I would say starting at home, we know that climate change has a direct impact on our own security, because of more extreme, frequent, destructive, extreme weather events. We know that that has an impact on our resilience. It can have an impact on our readiness, on our ability to deploy. And of course, it also places additional constraints on our militaries, who are more and more called upon to support civilian preparedness and disaster relief efforts. So it does have although a lot of the work has traditionally been, even in the literature, about looking at climate change change affects us far away, I think it's very important that we also look at the Euro-Atlantic area. We see there's changes happening here and now that we need to deal with. We also look at climate change and its impact as intensifying geopolitical competition, and that's already been mentioned. And I think given that the defining feature of our security environment is the return, or if you wish, the resurgence of strategic competition, I think how climate change intersects with that dynamic is also extremely important. And again, that happens far away, but it happens also close to our home, in our own neighborhood. Let's think, for example, of the high north and the Arctic, which is part of the Euro-Atlantic area as far as we are concerned. So these are already looking at the impact of climate change on security closer to us. Then, of course, there is also an importance of reflecting how climate change and the impact of climate change on security also affects our neighborhood. And here we go more into of course recognizing the impact of climate as a as a threat multiplier, but also we're talking more and more about a crisis multiplier, a factor that exacerbate pre-existing grievances, exacerbate pre-existing state fragility, pre-existing conflict, and can again have a direct impact on our security at home, for example, by contributing to fuel conflict, by contributing to fuel terrorism, by driving human displacement. So again, I bring it back to this as an impact on us directly, but then of course it also has an impact on how we deploy our militaries, because if there is more climate change exacerbated conflict, that might also generate additional needs to deploy our own forces. So I would say I'm just trying to paint a picture where what I'm trying to say is we look at this as an all-encompassing impact. And then in the remaining couple of minutes that I take before giving you back the floor, I would say we're not just looking at the impact of climate change on security in terms of the threat assessment, which of course is really, really important. And here we need to be really deliberate in showcasing that it is cross-cutting from the near abroad, from abroad to at home. But we're also talking on the impact of climate change on how our military operate. And here I'm happy to go more into details because as NATO as an organization has many decades of experience looking at how environmental changes affect our militaries. The issue of energy efficiency was just mentioned. And of course, since 2014, we have a green defense effort that works exactly on that, minimizing dependence on fossil fuels for our supplies, especially for our out-of-area operations. But more general, I think that it's incredibly important to take a comprehensive view and a comprehensive analysis of how climate change affects really every part of our militaries, from the planning to the capability development to the acquisitions and procurement, to how we maintain operational effectiveness in more complex weather conditions, to how we do our planning, exercises, training. So it is really a cross-cutting effort. And that's why in our climate and security agenda, which I'm sure we can talk a little bit more of in the next round, we make a big emphasis on going through all these phases and having a natural adaptation plan for the alliance and for allies. So I'll stop here, not to take too much time.
Thank you very much. That was very useful and insightful presentation. Now, because you said something important, that climate change doesn't stop at the borders. And here also, all of you mentioned the fact that climate change has geopolitical consequences, not only security consequences. So I want to go back to Ms. Sikorsky and ask you, how is climate security perceived in Washington, and are there any area of cooperation between the transatlantic relations?
Yeah, absolutely. To answer your second question first, I think there are absolutely opportunities for cooperation. And as the other speakers have mentioned, no one country can tackle these issues alone. I think a few areas for cooperation. One includes, sharing of best practices and data and technologies, right, to build a better risk assessment writ large of climate security threats around the world, and building the right tools and warning systems, early warning systems to recognize those risks. I think that's something that the United States, I know that the Defense Department here and others are interested in collaborating with NATO and other allies and partners on that. So I think that's key. I think also in terms of the mitigation side and thinking about interoperability and innovations and opportunities there towards green technologies, I think that is a key area for collaboration as well. And I think in the conflict prevention and peace building space, there's a lot of room for understanding best practices. How do you best bring a climate lens to that work? What does that look like on the ground? How do you build a climate strong workforce, national security workforce? I think that is something, again, from the perspective from the United States, to make sure that the gains we've had in the past year here in the US are sustained in the long run and are not subject to political wins, if you will, in the White House. How do you look throughout the State Department, Defense Department, USAID, all of the agencies to think through what skills and abilities you need in the workforce to bring that climate lens and mainstream it? So it's not just siphoned off, siloed off in a climate office somewhere, but instead the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East, for example, when she's developing her strategy for the region, brings a climate security perspective to that strategy, and thinks about how that will shape what the US needs to do there. I think that's a key piece. I think also one other thing, just looking ahead to next year, this year it was a lot about doing reports and building assessments, and the Defense Department released a risk assessment and an adaptation plan, and there was a national intelligence estimate from the intelligence community on climate risks. And so now that we've done that homework, right, how do we move from analysis to action going forward? And that, I think, will be a key area for the US in the coming year, particularly now that COP is over. And while mitigation and cutting emissions is absolutely critical to the climate security picture in the long term, there are near-term threats, as other folks have pointed out, that even if all emissions were cut tomorrow, we'll still be here. And so thinking through adaptation and resilience to those and moving to action is critical.
Thank you very much. You brought important questions. So, but I want to ask this question to Mr. Waitz. So, also keeping in mind that you present us the external part of climate security and how European Union works for that, especially on crisis management operation around the world. But I'm curious, and probably our participants are also curious to hear more about the actions or policies or strategies that the European Union have in place in order to increase the resilience of the member states in regards to climate related security threats. Are there any initiatives in this regard? Can you give us some examples? What can we do better in the future?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, European Union is a compilation of nation states, and no decisions taken that are not backed or are not co-decided by member states. In the moment, we're having a very interesting discussion about the so-called strategic compass, and also there you will find quite a chapter on the question on how to react to new security threats and how to adapt also. And absolutely within the countries, it's very related to actual conflicts on the ground. So different member states are differently involved. As you know, France in the Sahel zone, as an example, and there you have a very direct impact also on the national security, on the troops of nations that are not sent within an EU mission. And we're sharing the effort, we're sharing the knowledge, and we need the member states to adopt actually climate and security policies within their very own security programs, because also European Union, the deployment of troops depends very much on the member states. The deployment of equipment depends very much on the member states. So it is directly linked with concrete actions together with the member states. And let me just also reflect very shortly on the geostrategical question. There's also another question that we need to answer, because the transition towards a low CO2 society, let's say, is requiring a lot of raw minerals that are very often and sometimes mainly positioned in conflict areas, and very often in areas that are affected also by climate-related or impacted conflicts. And also what we see is that more and more combatants or even terror groups are financing themselves through the extraction of these natural resources. So there is also another effect of our growing demand on certain substances like lithium or cobalt and so on, that we have to see that is fueling the conflicts where climate is also involved at the same time. So also on the whole, all of the question on where do we get our raw materials from, how do we secure a supply that is not destructive, that is not even adding to climate change, also mentioning deforestation that is very often happening in conflict areas, which is then accelerating the impacts of climate change in the region again. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. So these questions are also on the geostrategical. And what is a very big impact for Europe is the actual change within our very own energy supply and production schemes. This is posing direct, I would say, threats to our also geostrategical opponents. Let me mention Russia. The message that we want to decrease the use of oil and gas substantially within Europe is bad news for Mr. Putin, yeah, because that's what his country is basing his main economy on, and so there's direct influence on elections in the European Union. There's direct influence on public opinion within the European Union. So you see that also this has a geostrategical dimension for us. I just named Russia now, but it's by far not the only case where we have an added complexity of the topic related to security issues. Very much also, I mean, you see all the issues that we have on the Polish border, Baltic states, and so on, but I don't need to go into depth there. I think you know.
Thank you very much. Yes, you basically gave us very good examples of geopolitical clashes and how climate change relates to it. And this is a very interesting perspective. So now moving forward to Ms. Berti, I wanted to continue our discussion and what you mentioned previously, and wanted to give us some examples of actions or policies or strategies that NATO have in place in order to limit the negative impact of climate change.
Certainly. Yes. So over the past, before I get to the action plan and the climate and security agenda that were just recently over the last year adopted, I have to say that I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a lot of this actions build on experience that the Alliance has had for a number of years in this field. I would say now there is a step change. We're doing more, we're more deliberate, and we're doing it through the prism of climate change, which I think is politically very significant, but we never started from scratch. For example, for years now, we had a green defense program that worked with scientists to leverage green technologies to diminish our dependency on fossil fuels, to improve our operational effectiveness. And I always mention these two factors in tandem, because sometimes I think there used to be a little bit of sometimes some reluctance in engaging in this debate because of a false, in my opinion, a false dichotomy between becoming more energy efficient, more green, more sustainable, and losing operational effectiveness. And I think more and more we can say that's actually not the case. There is a win-win here. And I would say, just as a slight segue, that one of the very interesting debates that we haven't had yet, but I think we should, is as our societies transition away from fossil fuels, then this opens a number of dilemmas, of course, also for our military operators. And I think the more we deliberately invest in green technologies and deliberately invest in innovation through the lens of climate change, the more we're going to be technologically advanced and maintain our technological edge, which is something that will help us across the board in what is I would say, an environmental strategic competition. So just as a segue. So we're building on a lot of existing experience in developing environmental standards. The Alliance already had a variety of environmental standards that our 30 allies apply. But now there is, again, a step change. So just very practically, there are 3 main areas where work is ongoing and things are happening. One is awareness, and that's the simplest one to explain if you wish. This is about how do we mainstream and make sure that we look at everything through a climate lens. We look more deliberately at the impact of climate change on our missions, on our operations, on our military forces at home. How do we improve foresight, early warning, risk assessment, do more deliberate climate change elements into our training and exercise. So that's part of the work. Then there is I would say, a very significant strand of very significant adaptation set of issues. And here, this is not something that is going to happen overnight. It is a gradual process, of course, but we're starting with an alliance-wide regular mapping of our climate-related vulnerabilities across the alliance, with the objective to then to identify what are weak points when it comes to installations, facilities, bases, and then move into taking remedial steps so that we can increase our climate resilience. So that's already something very concrete and the work is ongoing. Then, of course, we're also looking at the impact of climate change on our resilience, and we're also looking at how do we integrate that in our resilience guidelines. So that's also quite practical. It is, again, as was stated before, this is about helping, supporting, working with the allies so that they implement in their national policies, because of course that's the way we operate. And then just not to take too much time, but I think I should mention that our third big leg of the strategy is really about mitigation. I think that's important because, of course, we need to prepare, we need to adapt, but we also need to be a responsible member of the international community, and everyone has their role to play. So we're working to make sure that we respond better and we mitigate the impact of climate change on our militaries, but we also make sure that we mitigate the impact of our militaries on climate change. And that's the work, and that's I would say, the area that is still more newer. But I would just report a couple of, I think, very promising steps. One is we have agreed and we're now developing the first joint methodology to map emissions from activities, facilities, operations, missions across the alliance. That's already very important because we don't have a common methodology to look at emissions. So first one, we need to know what we're doing and how we're doing if we want to then improve ourselves. So that's something already in the pipeline, and we're hoping to get this done by the next summit. So we're in the next year, and on top of that, we're also working to develop what will, on the basis of these principles, emission reductions goals that we are going then that the Secretary General is then going to put forward for the allies. So we're also taking the mitigation leg of the strategy very seriously, and a cross-cutting issue that I need to mention, because of course it's important, especially in the context of this discussion, is key to do that, in our opinion, is cooperation with other partners, with other international organizations. Really important area in which we see a lot of potential to do more with the European Union. The point is, really, we have different tools, different assets, and this is one of those challenges where we all need to work together. So we also are going to start next year in 2022 to convey and to convey an annual climate change and security high-level dialogue to bring together all these actors and start seeing how do we best share, how do we share better best practices, how do we work together, because ultimately this is I mean, I know it's a cliche, but it is a true one. It's one of those challenges with really no single organization or country or continent can tackle it by itself. So whereas we're never going to be the first responder, of course, but we have a role to play when it comes to security and defense, and I think that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Yes, you're right. And I also share your perspective that we need to have these international discussions, how to increase the security of our environment, of our nations, regarding of where we are. But my question is that we already see the geopolitical sides of the climate security, and we see also that after the COP26 that Russia, India and China didn't agree with the measures or the decision taking there, and they said that they will adapt and reduce the emission at their own pace, and they don't want to follow the trend that the European Union or United States are trying to propose, the Western societies. So how can we make sure, how can we convince these states, and especially sometimes in the southern, the global south, that they are saying that they are the ones who are the most impacted of the climate security and the climate effects, but they are the ones who contributed the less to this security threat. So how can we make sure that we keep these states and these political actors motivated, or somehow in a way of cooperation to work together in the future? This is a question for all of you.
I'm happy to start on that question, and I might separate out the question of the global south from the India, China, Russia question. I think when it comes to the global south, I mean, their point is a fair one, and I think that's where looking at funding for the Global Adaptation Fund, finding ways to support those countries in managing the risks that they are being disproportionately hit with, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it actually, as we've all been discussing, serves broader global security as well, in a way to prevent instability and prevent conflict in places we care about. So I think that's key, is putting Western and global North countries putting their money where their mouth is, and supporting that adaptation and resilience building, so those countries can manage the risks. In terms of the questions around China and Russia, those that the US considers competitors or potential adversaries, I think the first thing to do, and this is me putting on my intelligence hat from my previous work, is to develop a better understanding of the actual risks, climate security risks, those countries themselves face. Because part of what's going to drive their behavior is how they perceive the risks to themselves. And if you look at China in particular, you can see that it's not monolithic in its understanding of the climate risks. And just as we in the West are having internal debates sometimes in the United States about how quickly to decarbonize, and issues with coal mining and fossil fuels, you see some of that discussion happening in China. And so the question is, how do you, I think for outside actors, is how do you empower the voices that are pushing to more quickly decarbonize there, and maybe that's through some cooperation, but it also at times might be through competition in terms of a race to the top for technologies and green energy and renewable energy. But China is not immune, right? They had horrible floods this past summer in their internal parts of the country that flooded subways. They are not prepared with adaptation and resilience to the level they need to be. They have millions of people who live on the coast who are subject to sea level rise. They have food security concerns. based on both fish stocks, but also desertification and environmental degradation in the internal part of their country. So it is in their own interests, I would argue, to take action on reducing emissions as well. And I think the more that we can understand that and not make it a binary choice between cooperation or competition, or think that all of their decisions are based on what we in the West do, is a good place to start. But it's certainly complicated, and I don't mean to minimize the challenge, but I think the first part, especially in the climate security community, is a better understanding of the climate security risks facing those countries.
Maybe I'll, I'll be very quick, because this is, I'll wait in, but not, I don't, of course, that's this, the scope of the conversation, the scope of this question is beyond, it does not allow me to give a NATO response. So if for 2 seconds I can give a Benedetta response, and for what it's worth, I would say that this is it's a very important debate. And I think that's why it's more and more important to talk about climate security as well as along with climate justice, right? It's not either or; the two should be seen together. And I think there should be a climate justice lens through which we look at the progress that we make. So, for example, in fragile, we know that even if a lot of well-meaning solution may not go down well in areas that are fragile or not well governed or with weak governance, if they are not done in a way that actually reaches the most vulnerable communities, those that need that climate finances the most, and if it doesn't have a conflict sensitive lens. So I think we should be able to balance and take all these needs and requirements into consideration, because ultimately, again, personal 2 cents, I don't believe that there's any other way to have a sustainable way forward unless we balance climate security, climate justice, and mitigation. But that's just me.
Very well start where you ended. I mean, as global warming is a global threat, European Union started to talk with the Chinese delegation, even though we have real tensions in the moment, but we just decided that this is a cause that goes beyond other causes, and we need to talk to China because it's nearly a third of the global emissions in the moment that stem from China. So we did so. In the negotiations, it was rather difficult with China, because until the very last Friday of the COP, China actually didn't say anything. They didn't say what they want, but they also didn't say what they do not want. So there was a lot of backdoor diplomacy. And I just want to reiterate that the least developed countries were not the ones actually blocking a more ambitious compromise at the very end. Just to say that, but it's countries that are in development or even already quite developed, as China is. And there, the main dynamic at the COP was more actually about loss and damage than on the actual final formulations on phase down coal, whatever that means. But this was a bit of a payback, because least developed countries, but also China, India, were expecting more commitments of the industrialized states when it comes to loss and damage, which refers to the historic responsibility when it comes to the amounts of emissions that have been emitted. And there, I would say the engagement neither of the European Union nor of US was like fulfilling the expectations. But just to give you a background on that as well, it's not directly pointing out on a lack of will to look into that exactly global justice and climate justice question, but it's also a question of how do we secure that money that might be put on the table is really used for a systematic change in local economies, rather than maybe used to just fill some budget gaps, where I mean, most of the countries have a lot of good reasons to spend money on, and well understandable, but it's not going to help us in the battle against global warming going if we put finances into countries where we have no transparency, no guarantees, no clear plans also, where sometimes the absorption capacity of the countries to really use that money as a leverage for private investments and so on is very restricted. And so this was also very much a dynamic that we saw on the COP. And yes, I mean, this is something we have to work on. After the COP is before the COP, so it's already the talks on what concretely can we put on the table are happening already. And last but not least, also the question on adaptation and mitigation. One of the successes, if I may call it so, from the COP26 was that finally also developed countries were ready to also invest into adaptation, because we have to realize that to really stop the impact on the countries globally, we're out too late already. There is an impact to deal with, so we need to also look into adaptation and also finance adaptation. But this is also a bit of a tricky question, because swifting too many resources from mitigation, which is actually reducing the threat and reducing the emissions, changing too much money towards the adaptation will not help us in the end, because within a few years, if we don't manage to reduce our emissions within a few years, any adaptation will be unaffordable for any of our economies. And so this is also one of the tricky questions, I would say, which we have to keep our radar on.
Thank you, Mr. Waitz. I have a question for you from one of our participants. Will the EU climate law, which makes EU emissions reductions legally binding, also apply to the military sector? And could this create issues with NATO's interoperability if those allies who are also EU member states are legally bound to green their militaries and others are not, and that might move to a slower pace?
Yes, in fact, the climate law is also including our military sectors. So it's climate mainstreaming over the whole sector. But I do not think that this is in any contradiction with the NATO engagement. I mean, I'm personally coming from a non-NATO country, but the majority of our member states are NATO member states. There's no contradiction at all, because to be very honest on that, NATO is, when it comes to assessment of climate security risks, and also when it comes to the implementation into strategic planning, into also equipment and so on, is a bit ahead of the European Union. So I know, and I'm very proud of us in the European Union moving forward and being like the spearhead when it comes to real climate action. But in terms of security and climate, NATO is a bit ahead of us and is already a bit further in implementing also concrete measurements into their planning. And I think so that's not a contradiction at all. It's actually the other way around. There's a very strong cooperation between the European Union and NATO on that question. We're exchanging best practice. We're also trying to set up common databases. So it's a common approach, and I do not see any operability compromised through that.
Thank you very much. As we are running out of time, may I ask you, all of you, to give a short 1-minute key point that you would like our audience to take from our discussion? Who wants to start?
I can if you want me to. Or no, Benedetta.
I just wanted to avoid the awkward moment of silence, but I think that the awkward moment of silence is because we touched upon so many themes, so it's quite difficult to come up with a 1-minute summary. I think, if anything, and forgive me if this is not the most sophisticated thought, but compared to where we were even 18 months ago in this conversation on climate security, I think this is really, I don't want us to be complacent. I don't think there is time to be, we don't have the time and the luxury to be complacent, but I think we can take maybe a second to reflect on the fact that there's been a massive move forward when it comes to bringing the defense and security sector on board when it comes to climate change, which also answers indirectly your past questions about what about interoperability, what about stalling our modernization. I think that's a legitimate question, but I think more and more our answer can be no, to the contrary. We're going to become more effective, and so just a moment to reflect that the things are moving in the right direction, and this type of events are helpful to remind us all of all the work that we still have to do, but also the potential for cooperation. So not the most sophisticated thought, but that's what I could come up with for 1 minute.
I can absolutely sign up to your statement and maybe add that it's an excellent example how cooperation actually works and between US, between NATO, EU, but also United Nations and some other states like Canada and Australia, where we once again see how important that international cooperation between our allies is and how well it functions. That's quite surprising for me, and as now climate change and security has reached, I would say, the center of the debate on future also strategic planning, which I welcome very much. This cooperative mode makes me very hopeful that we really find answers and we look at the actual threat and dimension that has in a realistic way, and we finally draw the right conclusions, and this is very encouraging for me.
Yeah, and I'll end by just echoing, I think, the hopeful note that both Benedetta and Thomas brought to the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, I think the fact that we have such strong predictive capabilities that are getting better all the time, that we can integrate into strategy and planning to tackle climate security risks, is a huge opportunity that we can take advantage of, and there is growing cooperation to do so. And the more we can build on that momentum going forward in 2022, the better place we'll be in, because as was also said earlier, there's no time to waste, right? These risks are growing with every day that passes, and the sooner we get ahead of them, the better. And I think there's a real opportunity for that action now. So glad to be part of this conversation and hear about the great work happening at both EU and NATO on this. So thank you.
Thank you again to our excellent panelists for their valuable ideas and comments, and thank you for sending your questions and for following our online event. We at TPC have many more great events in the pipeline, so please follow us online and see you at the next event. Have an enjoyable afternoon, everyone.